The 1848 revolution in France, sometimes known as the February Revolution, was one of a wave of revolutions in 1848 in Europe. In France, the revolutionary events ended the Orleans monarchy and led to the creation of the French Second Republic. Following the overthrow of Louis Philippe in February, the elected government of the Second Republic ruled France. In the months that followed, this government steered a course that became more conservative. On June 23, 1848, the people of Paris rose in insurrection, which became known as June Days Uprising, a bloody but unsuccessful rebellion by the Paris workers against a conservative turn in the Republic's course. On December 2, 1848, Louie Napoleon was elected President of the Second Republic, largely on peasant support. Exactly 4 years later he suspended the elected assembly, establishing the Second French Empire, which lasted until 1871. The February Revolution established the principle of the right to work, and its newly established government created national workshops for the unemployed. At the same time a sort of industrial parliament was established at the Luxembourg Palace, under the presidency of Louis Blanc, with the object of preparing a scheme for the organization of labor. These tensions between liberal Orleanist and radical Republicans and Socialists led to the June Days Uprising. Background: under the Charter of 1814, Louis XVIII ruled France as the head of a constitutional monarchy. Upon Louis XVIII's death, his brother, the Count of Artois, ascended to the throne in 1825, as Charles X. Supported by the ultra-royalists. Charles X was an extremely unpopular reactionary monarch whose aspirations were far more grand than those of his deceased brother. He had no desire to rule as a constitutional monarch, taking various steps to strengthen his own authority as monarch and weaken that of the lower house. In 1830, Charles X of France, presumably instigated by one of his chief advisers Jules, Prince de Polignac, issued the 4 Ordinances of St. Cloud. These ordinances abolished freedom of the press, reduced the electorate by 75%, and dissolved the lower house. This action provoked an immediate reaction from the citizenry, who revolted against the monarchy during the 3 glorious days of 26 July 29, 1830. Charles was forced to abdicate the throne and to flee Paris for the United Kingdom. As a result, Louis Philippe, of the Orleanist branch, rose to power, replacing the old charter by the Charter of 1830, and his rule became known as the July Monarchy. Nicknamed the bourgeois monarch, Louis Philippe sat at the head of a moderately liberal state controlled mainly by educated elites. Supported by the Orleanists, he was opposed on his right by the Legitimists and on his left by the Republicans and Socialists. Louis Philippe was an expert businessman and, by means of his businesses, he had become one of the richest men in France. Still, Louis Philippe saw himself as the successful embodiment of a small businessman. Consequently, he and his government did not look with favor on the big business, especially the industrial section of the French bourgeoisie. Louis Philippe did, however, support the bankers, large and small. Indeed, at the beginning of his reign in 1830, Jacques Lafitte, a banker and liberal politician who supported Louis Philippe's rise to the throne, said, "From now on, the bankers will rule." Accordingly, during the reign of Louis Philippe, the privileged financial aristocracy, that is bankers, stock exchange magnates, railroad barons, owners of coal mines, iron ore mines, and forests and all landowners associated with them tended to support Louis Philippe, while the industrial section of the bourgeoisie which may have owned the land their factories sat on but nothing much more, were disfavored by Louis Philippe and actually tended to side with the middle class and laboring class in opposition to Louis Philippe in the Chamber of Deputies. Naturally, land ownership was favored, and this elitism resulted in the disenfranchisement of much of the middle and working classes. By 1848 only about 1% of the population held the franchise. Even though France had a free press and trial by jury, only landholders were permitted to vote, which alienated the petty bourgeoisie and even the industrial bourgeoisie from the government. Louis Philippe was viewed as generally indifferent to the needs of society, especially to those members of the middle class who were excluded from the political arena. Early in 1848, some Orleanist liberals, such as Adolphe Thiers, had turned against him, disappointed by Louis Philippe's opposition to parliamentarism. A reform movement developed in France which urged the government to expand the electoral franchise, just as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland had done in 1832. The more radical Democrats of the reform movement coalesced around the newspaper, La copyright form. However, the more moderate Republicans and the liberal opposition rallied around the La National newspaper. Starting in July 1847, the reformists of all shades began to hold banquets at which toasts were drunk to ra copyright publique fraternelles, liberté copyright, égalité copyright, and fraternité copyright, etc. However, Louis Philippe turned a deaf ear to the reform movement, and discontent among wide sections of the French people continued to grow. Social and political discontent sparked revolutions in France in 1830 and 1848, which in turn inspired revolts in other parts of Europe. Charles X began to act like an absolute ruler, which forced liberals to set up a constitutional monarchy. Workers lost their jobs, bread prices rose, people accused the government of corruption. The French revolted and set up a republic. French successes led to other revolts, including those who wanted relief from the suffering caused by the Industrial Revolution, and nationalism sprang up hoping for independence from foreign rulers. Alexis de Tocqueville had observed, "We are sleeping together in a volcano. A wind of revolution blows, the storm is on the horizon." Lacking the property qualifications to vote, the lower classes were about to erupt in revolt. Economic and international influences. The French middle class watched changes in Britain with interest. When Britain's Reform Act of 1832 extended enfranchisement to any person paying £10 or more per year, France's free press took interest. Meanwhile, economically, the working class may perhaps have been slightly better off than Britain's working class. Still, unemployment in France threw skilled workers down to the level of the proletariat. The only nominally social law of the July monarchy was passed in 1841. This law prohibited the use of child labor of those children under 8 years of age, and the employment of children less than 13 years old for nighttime work. This law, however, was routinely flouted. The year 1846 saw a financial crisis and bad harvests, and the following year saw an economic depression. A poor railroad system hindered aid efforts, and the peasant rebellions that resulted were forcefully crushed. Perhaps a third of Paris was on the dole. Dangerous writers proliferated, such as Louis Blanc and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. The events of February, because political gatherings and demonstrations were outlawed in France, activists of the largely middle-class opposition to the government began to hold a series of fundraising banquets. This campaign of banquets was intended to circumvent the governmental restriction on political meetings and provide a legal outlet for popular criticism of the regime. The campaign began in July 1847. Friedrich Engels was in Paris dating from October 1847 and was able to observe and attend some of these banquets. He wrote a series of articles on these banquets, including the reform movement in France, which was published in the La Réforme on November 20, 1847. Split in the Camp the Réforme and the Nationale March of Democracy, published in the Northern Star on December 4, 1847. Reform Banquet at Lille Speech of Le Drarolin, published in the Northern Star on December 16, 1847. Reform Movement in France Banquet of Dijon, published in the Northern Star on December 18, 1847. The Ra copyright form and the National, published in the Deutsche Bra-1/4 Zeitung on December 30, 1847. And Louis Blanc's speech at the Dijon banquet, published in the Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung on December 30, 1847. The banquet campaign lasted until all political banquets were outlawed by the French government in February 1848. As a result, the people revolted, helping to unite the efforts of the popular Republicans and the liberal Orleanists, who turned their back on Louis Philippe. Anger over the outlawing of the political banquets brought crowds of Parisians flooding out into the streets at noon on February 22, 1848. The crowds directed their anger against the citizen King Louis Philippe and his chief minister for foreign and domestic policy, Frère Section Pierre-Guillaume Guizot. Shouting "Down with Guizot," and long live the reform. The crowds marched past Guizot's residence. The crowds erected barricades in the streets of Paris, and fighting broke out between the citizens and the Parisian municipal guards. At 2 p.m. the next day, February 23, Prime Minister Guizot resigned. Upon hearing the news of Guizot's resignation, a large crowd gathered outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. An officer ordered the crowd not to pass, but people in the front of the crowd were being pushed by the rear. The officer ordered his men to fix bayonets, probably wishing to avoid shooting. However, in what is widely regarded as an accident, a soldier discharged his musket, which resulted in the rest of the soldiers firing into the crowd. 52 people were killed. Paris was soon a barricaded city. Omnibuses were turned into barricades, and thousands of trees were felled. Fires were set, and angry citizens began converging to the royal palace. King Louis Philippe abdicated and fled to the UK. The Second Republic. On February 26, 1848, the liberal opposition came together to organise a provisional government, called the Second Republic. The poet Alphonse de Lamartine was appointed president of the provisional government. Lamartine served as a virtual dictator of France for the next 3 months. Elections for a constituent assembly were scheduled for April 23, 1848. The Constituent Assembly was to establish a new republican government for France. In preparation for these elections, 2 major goals of the provisional government were universal suffrage and unemployment relief. Universal male suffrage was enacted on March 2, 1848, giving France 9 million new voters. As in all other European nations, women did not have the right to vote. However, during this time a proliferation of political clubs emerged, including women's organizations. Relief for the unemployed was achieved by the provisional government by enactment of the national workshops, which guaranteed French citizens' right to work. The right of a citizen to work and indeed the national workshops themselves had been the idea of Jean-Joseph Louis Blanc. By May 1848 the national workshops were employing 100,000 workers and paying out daily wages of 70,000 livres. Full employment proved far from workable, as peak unemployment may have peaked at around 800,000 people, with much underemployment on top of that. On May 31, 1500, jobless French rioted as rising xenophobia persecuted Belgian workers in the north. In 1848, 479 newspapers were founded alongside a 54% decline in the number of businesses in Paris, as most wealth had evacuated the city. There was a corresponding decline in the luxury trade and credit became expensive. The rise of conservatism within the Second Republic. Naturally, the provisional government was disorganized as it attempted to deal with France's economic problems. The conservative elements of French society were wasting no time in organizing against the provisional government. After roughly a month, conservatives began to openly oppose the new government, using the rallying cry order, which the new republic lacked. Additionally, there was a major split between the citizens of Paris and those citizens of the more rural areas of France. The provisional government set out to establish deeper government control of the economy and guarantee more an equal distribution of resources. As noted above, to deal with the unemployment problem, the provisional government established national workshops. The unemployed were given jobs building roads and planting trees without regard for the demand for these tasks. The population of Paris ballooned as job seekers from all over France came to Paris to work in the newly formed national workshops. To pay for these the new national workshops and the other social programs, the provisional government placed new taxes on land. These taxes alienated the landed classes especially the small farmers and the peasantry of the rural areas of France from the provisional government. Hard-working rural farmers were resistant to paying for the unemployed city people and their new right to work national workshops. The taxes were widely disobeyed in the rural areas and, thus, the government remained very financially strapped for cash. Popular uncertainty about the liberal foundations of the provisional government became apparent in the 23 April 1848 elections. Despite the agitation from the left, voters elected a constituent assembly which was primarily moderate and conservative. In May, Jacques-Charles Dupontellier, chairman of the Provisional Government, made way for the Executive Commission, a body of state acting as head of state with 5 co-presidents. The results of the 23 April 1848 election were a disappointment to the radicals in Paris except for the election of one candidate popular among urban workers, Front-Section Vincent Raspail. Many radicals felt the elections were a sign of the slowing down of the revolutionary movement. These radicals in Paris pressured the government to head an international crusade for democracy. Independence of other European states, such as Poland, was urged by the Paris radicals. In 1848, Poland as a national state did not exist. The nation of Poland had been gradually partitioned, or divided between foreign powers of Prussia, Russia, and Austria in 1773, 1793. Finally in 1795, all of the Polish nation was swallowed up by the three powers. However, it was an opportune time to raise the issue of Polish independence as Poles were also undergoing their own period of revolt in 1848, starting with the uprising in Potsdam on March 20, 1848. However, the government of the National Constituent Assembly continued to resist the radicals. The radicals began to protest against the National Constituent Assembly government. On May 15, 1848, Parisian workmen, feeling their democratic and social republic was slipping away, invaded the assembly en masse and proclaimed a new provisional government. This attempted revolution on the part of the working classes was quickly suppressed by the National Guard. The leaders of this revolt are Louis Auguste Blanqui, Armand Barber S., Front-Section Vincent Raspail and Ethursa were arrested. The trial of these leaders was held in Bourges, France, from March 7 to April 3, 1849. The conservative classes of society were becoming increasingly fearful of the power of the working classes in Paris. They felt a strong need for organization and organized themselves around the need for order, the so-called Party of Order. For the Party of Order, the term order meant a rollback of society to days of Louis Philippe. The Party of Order was now the dominant member of the government. As the main force of reaction against revolution, the Party of Order forced the closure of the hated right-to-work national workshops on June 21, 1848. On June 23, 1848, the working class of Paris rose in protest over the closure of the national workshops. On that day 170,000 citizens of Paris came out into the streets to erect barricades. To meet this challenge, the government appointed General Louis Eugène Cavaignac to lead the military forces suppressing the uprising of the working classes. General Cavaignac had been serving in the army in Algeria. Cavaignac had returned from Algeria, and in the elections of April 23, 1848, he was elected to the National Constituent Assembly. Cavaignac arrived in Paris only on May 17, 1848 to take his seat in the National Assembly. Between June 23 and June 26, 1848, this battle between the working class and Cavaignac came to be known as the June Days Uprising. Cavaignac's forces started out on June 23, 1848 with an army composed of from 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers of the Paris garrison of the French army. Cavaignac began a systematic assault against the revolutionary Parisian citizenry, targeting the blockaded areas of the city. However, he was not able to break the stiff opposition put up by the armed workers on the barricades on June 23, 1848. Accordingly, Cavaignac's forces were reinforced with another 20,000 25,000 soldiers from the Mobile Guard, some additional 60,000 to 80,000 from the National Guard. Even with this force of 120,000 to 125,000 soldiers, Cavaignac still required 2 days to complete the suppression of the working class uprising. In February 1848, the workers and petite bourgeoisie had fought together, but now, in June 1848, the lines were drawn differently. The working classes had been abandoned by the bourgeois politicians who founded the provisional government. This would prove fatal to the Second Republic, which, without the support of the working classes, could not continue. Although the governmental regime of the Second Republic continued to survive until December 1852, the generous, idealistic republic to which the February days had given birth, ended with the suppression of the June days. the Party of Order moved quickly to consolidate the forces of reaction in the government, and on June 28, 1848, the government appointed Louis Napoleon as the head of the French state. On December 10, 1848, a presidential election was held between four candidates. Cavaignac was the candidate of the Party of Order. Alexandre Auguste Louis Rollin was also a candidate in that presidential election. Louis Rollin was the editor of the Lara copyright form newspaper and as such was the leader of the radical Democrats among the petty bourgeoisie. From a section while Vincent Raspail was the candidate of the revolutionary working classes. Louis Napoleon copyright on Bonaparte was the fourth presidential candidate. Napoleon III won the presidential election of December 10, 1848 with 5,587,759 votes as opposed to 1,474,687 votes for Cavaignac and 370,000 votes for Louis Rollin. Raspail ended up a distant fourth in the balloting. Class struggles within the revolution. Karl Marx saw the June Days Uprising as strong evidence of class conflict. Marx saw the revolution as being directed by the desires of the middle class. While the bourgeoisie agitated for proper participation, the workers themselves had other concerns. Many of the participants in the 1848 revolution were of the so-called petite bourgeoisie. Indeed, the petite, or petty bourgeoisie outnumbered the working classes by about 2 to 1 in 1848. However, the financial position of the petty bourgeoisie was extremely tenuous. Because of the economic recession of 1846–47, the petty bourgeoisie had developed a great burden of debt as they attempted to stay in business. By 1848, in Paris alone 21 million francs of this debt was overdue. In the provinces another 11 million francs of commercial paper were overdue. During the February Revolution a united front had been presented by all classes of society who were in opposition to Louis Philippe. Both the industrial bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie had joined with the working classes in the February Revolution in order to obtain proper participation in the government for all sections and classes in society. However, as the working classes became more dissatisfied with the small share of this participation they actually received, they revolted and sought to have their demands heard in the streets. All the propertied classes of the February Revolution, that is the finance bourgeoisie, the industrial bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, became fearful of the workers' revolt. Thus, the industrial bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie turned on their former allies in the February Revolution and moved to repress the working class uprising during the June Days. No class worked harder to suppress the workers' revolt than did the petty bourgeoisie. However, since February, because slow sales and economic dislocations of the revolution, the financial condition of the small merchants and shopkeepers of the petty bourgeoisie had deteriorated even further. As of June 1848, over 7,000 shopkeepers and merchants in Paris had not paid their rent since February. During the June Days, the creditors holding all the commercial paper for those loans and the landlords to whom the back rent was owed, forestalled most attempts to enforce judgment to collect on those debts and back rent owed by the petty bourgeoisie. Once the worker revolt was put down, however, the creditors and landlords began to assert their claims for back rent and overdue debts in court. Bankruptcies and foreclosures rose dramatically following June 1848. It was as if the petty bourgeoisie returned home after their heroic fight against the working class on behalf of the propertied classes only to find that their allies in that fight had turned against them and turned them out of their businesses and homes. The petty bourgeoisie gathered in a large demonstration at the National Assembly to force the government to inquire into the problem of foreclosures and requiring an extension of debt for all those businessmen who could prove that their insolvency was caused by the revolution itself. Although a plan containing this proposal was introduced in the National Assembly, the plan was rejected in the end. Thus, the petty bourgeoisie was betrayed and left to its own resources. The result was the pauperization of the petty bourgeoisie. Eventually, individual shopkeepers and merchants left their own failed businesses and sought wage labor and thus became part of the laboring class themselves. Accordingly, the provisional government, which had been created to address the concerns of the all classes of French society, did not have enough of a foothold in the working classes to be successful in this effort. Therefore, in the end, the provisional government tended to address only the concerns of the liberal bourgeoisie and forgot the concerns of the working class and the concerns of the petty bourgeoisie. Support for the provisional government was especially weak in the countryside, where a vast amount of France's population was agricultural and traditionally less revolutionary. Though the peasantry countryside did have their own concerns, such as food shortages as a result of bad harvests, the concerns of the bourgeoisie were still too far off from those of the lower classes. Also, the memory of the French Revolution was still fresh in the minds of the French. The Thermidorian reaction, and the ascent of Napoleon III to the throne are evidence that the people preferred the safety of enable dictatorship to the uncertainty of revolution. Louis Napoleon portrayed himself as rising above politics. Each class saw Louis Napoleon as a reenactment of the great days of Napoleon Bonaparte. The various classes of France each had different visions of what a return to the days of Napoleon Bonaparte would mean, and they supported Louis Napoleon for different reasons. This phenomenon was precisely what Karl Marx meant when he said history repeats itself, the first time as a tragedy, the second time as a farce. The various classes and political groupings in France each had different reasons for supporting Louis Napoleon in the election of December 10, 1848. Louis Napoleon, himself encouraged this by being all things to all people. Both the Legitimists and the Orleans monarchists saw Louis Napoleon as the beginnings of a royalist restoration in France. The army voted for Napoleon because they saw Napoleon as a supporter of an active foreign policy war instead of peace. The big industrial bourgeoisie supported Louis Napoleon as a means of breaking with the proletariat and the other revolutionary forces. They felt that Louis Napoleon would suppress all further revolutionary activity. Even sections of the proletariat supported Louis Napoleon because they saw Louis Napoleon as a means of getting rid of the hated Cavaignac and the hated bourgeoisie republicanism of the National Assembly, which had betrayed the proletarian interests in the recent June days. The petty bourgeoisie saw Louis Napoleon as the rule of the debtor over the creditor, as their savior against the large finance capitalists, who had denied them any kind of relief from their crashing debts despite the loyal support the petty bourgeoisie had provided the propertied interests in the June days suppression of the revolution. Then there was the peasantry, which overwhelmingly supported Louis Napoleon. The support of the peasantry for Louis Napoleon was so strong that the election of Louis Napoleon has been seen as a coup d'état or an insurrection of the peasantry. Thus, one might argue, without the support of these large lower classes, the revolution of 1848 would not carry through, despite the hopes of the liberal bourgeoisie. The end of the revolution in France. Following the repression of the June days, the French Revolution of 1848 was basically over. Politics in France continued to tilt to the right, as the era of revolution in France came to an end. However, the Party of Order and the Cavaignac dictatorship were still fearful of another popular uprising in the streets. Accordingly, on September 2, 1848, the government continued the state of siege that had been in place since the June days. Also on September 2, 1848, the National Constituent Assembly vowed not to dissolve itself until they had written a new constitution and enacted all the organic laws necessary to implement that new constitution. Although the National Constituent Assembly had attempted to write a constitution before the June days, only a first draft of that constitution had been written before the repression in June 1848. This first draft, however, still contained the phrase "right to work," and contained several provisions dealing with the demands of the working classes. In the eyes of the Party of Order, these provisions were now entirely unacceptable, especially in the new conservative political environment after the June days. Accordingly, on September 4, 1848, the National Constituent Assembly, now controlled by the Party of Order, set about writing a new constitution. The new constitution was finished on October 23, 1848, and presidential elections were scheduled for December 10, 1848. As noted above, Louis Napoleon won the presidential election by a wide margin over the current dictator Louis Cavaignac and the petty bourgeoisie socialist Alexandre Rollin. Louis Napoleon's family name of Napoleon rallied support to his cause. Elected with Louis Napoleon was a National Assembly which was filled with monarchists of either the legitimist variety or the Orleanist variety. As noted above, the Bourbons tended to support the landed aristocracy while the Orleanists tended to support the banking and finance bourgeoisie. One of those elected to the National Assembly was Adolphe Thiers, who was the leader of the Orleanist party. As such, Thiers became the chief spokesman of the finance bourgeoisie. However, as time went by, he was tending to speak for the whole bourgeoisie, including the rising industrial bourgeoisie. After sweeping the elections, Louis Napoleon tried to return France to the old order. Although Napoleon purged republicans and returning the vile multitude to its former place, Napoleon III was unable to totally turn the clock back. Indeed, the presidency of Louis Napoleon, followed by the Second Empire, would be a time of great industrialization and great economic expansion of railroads and banking. By the time of the December 2, 1851 coup, Louis Napoleon had dissolved the National Assembly without having the constitutional right to do so, and became the sole ruler of France. Cells of resistance surfaced, but were put down, and the Second Republic was officially over. He re-established universal suffrage, feared by the Republicans at the time who correctly expected the countryside to vote against the Republic. Louis Napoleon took the title Emperor Napoleon III, and the Second Empire began. In literature, Gustave Flaubert's novel La Copyright Education Sentimentale uses the 1848 revolution as a backdrop for its story. Karl Marx's essay The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon describes the 1848 revolution as a class struggle. Laura Kalpakian's novel Cosette uses the 1848 revolution as a primary part of the plot. Sylvia Townsend Warner's novel Summer Will Show uses the 1848 revolution as a primary part of the plot. Kurt Anderson's novel Heyday begins with one of the protagonists witnessing and unintentionally participating in the 1848 revolution. The character of Pyotr Alexandrovich Miusov, uncle and tutor of Dmitry Fyodorovich Karamazov in Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel The Brothers Karamazov, hinted that he himself had almost taken part in the fighting on the barricades in the 1848 revolution. L'Autre Dumas, a 2010 French film directed by Safi Neber, depicts Alexander Dumas in a fictitious involvement with a young female revolutionary. See also, France in the 19th century, History of Socialism, History of the French Left, The Revolutions of 1848 in the Habsburg Areas. Sources, Sylvie April, La Deuxième Ère Copyright Publique et le Second Empire, Pygmalion, 2000. Arnaud Cartant, 1848, Quand l'art copyright public combattait la d'art copyright démocratique, Mère Martin, 2009. Ina S. Murat, La Deuxième Ère Copyright Public, Fayard, 1987. George Ruder Copyright, The Crowd in History, Chapter 11, The French Revolution of 1848 feet, pp. 164–179, Philippe Vigier, La Seconde Ère Copyright Publique, Puf. Collection K. References